Dubai made its name as a global hub for trade, for travel and for tourism. It used the proceeds of oil to transform its economy. But as that trade shifts from west to east, what does it mean for the economies of this region? And are Gulf countries ready for life after oil? We're in Dubai to find out on this week's Talking Business. Located between Asia and Europe, the United Arab Emirates has been a natural hub for international trade. From the old wooden dhows that still ply the waters of the Gulf, to the vast container ships that transport cargo from around the world. Jebel Ali Port in Dubai handled over 17 million containers last year. That's expected to hit 22 million next year. These containers used to travel from east to west, full of goods made in Asia, like cars, computers and clothes. But a shift in global demand means a change in direction. Asia, and China in particular, are booming markets for exporters. And from the Gulf, that means oil. China is now the world's largest importer of Middle Eastern oil. But China's booming economy needs imports of goods and services too. And most of those pass through ports like this. So let's talk about some of those issues raised there. With me to discuss them is Danny Seabright. He's president of the US-UAE Business Council that's responsible for building business links between the two countries. Vipal Sadana, who's Chief Executive and Head of Maersk Trade Finance. Maersk, of course, one of the world's biggest transporters of shipping containers. And Dr. Dalia Al-Muthana, who's President and Chief Executive of GE Gulf, responsible for strategy at the engine, energy and healthcare giant here in the Gulf. Welcome to you all. Thanks for joining us here on Talking Business. Vipal, maybe I could start with you because you've got a great insight into where trade is coming from and where it's going to. What does the data tell you right now about how that's changing?
Global trade has been consistently growing steadily since World War II, but over the past few decades it's seen a real exponential growth. It's containerization in the last 60 years that has really led to this, and lower transportation costs. So pretty much everything that you touch from when you wake up in the morning with your cup of coffee till you go to bed is usually coming from somewhere else in the world. And this has given rise to new global value chains. So what is consumed in one country, parts of it or the whole of it sometimes is usually made elsewhere.
Dalia Al-Muthana, we think of trade very much so in terms of containers, goods being shipped around the world. At GE, of course, many will know the company for engines, commercial jet engines. And that's about shipping people around the world. Mm-hmm. Where there is growing demand for your jet engines, that tells us a lot about where people want to be in the world. What does your insight tell you?
If you look at the way that economy has evolved, 40 years ago when GE was, had first started off in this region, I could describe this region as more of a recipient of technology, and then that has evolved more into assembly, and then further into manufacturing, and then R&D, and now we talk about innovation and inventing new technologies that could then be exported to the global world.
Danny Seabright, if you look at the statistics, as far as UAE and US trade is concerned, I mean, it's staggering. US has a more than $20 billion surplus, trade surplus with the UAE. Talk me through how that's changed. You've been doing this quite a while. You must have seen things change.
So we've actually had a $24–25 billion surplus year in, year on for the last 5–6 years. And the UAE is the largest export market for the United States in the region, larger than Israel, larger than Turkey, larger than India. Many goods and services are re-exported to other places in the region, but the UAE becomes the hub, as Dalia was talking about, where the goods are brought in, where additional services and are added to them to make them before they go on to something else.
Now, I want to just talk quickly about your council itself, the US Business Council. That was born out of controversy, born out of the DP World, the big ports operator based here, buying up the ports business of P&O, and that angered many people in the United States.
Our council was formed to get more accurate information out about the relationship and the importance of it, both strategically, politically, and then in the trade and commercial relationship. I refer to the relationship as having three legs to the stool, and the commercial and trade relationship is one of the most important and one of the most vibrant, if you will, of the relationship.
Virpal, I'm interested in this idea of the Silk Road, the new Silk Road from China, and certainly we've seen from the leadership in China about creating these new trade routes. What does that mean for your business?
As a shipping company, about 150 of our shipping trade lanes pass through this region. So I think it is poised for diversification from being a traditional oil economy to going into trade. We talked about technology innovation, manufacturing, pharmaceutical. I think the latent potential energy of this region is much larger than it gets credit for.
Add into the mix a lot of what we've heard from the White House of late about protectionism, about walls going up, about putting America first. What does that mean for that trade that we've discussed that has been booming between the US and this region? Does that go away with talk of protectionism?
Well, first of all, the trade is pretty much one way. There's not very much coming back into the U.S. economy from the UAE at this point. We don't get any energy from the UAE. Most of the UAE, or almost all of the UAE's energy, goes the other way, towards China and Japan and places like that. There's a little bit of steel and a little bit of aluminum coming back into the U.S. market. So we are going to keep the wall down, if you will, for things going outward from the U.S. to many of these countries going forward. I worry about storm clouds on the horizon, if you will, in the future. And I think the talk that in Washington, I think the talk of protectionism fans the talk of protectionism around the world in general. And that's the trend line that I worry about.
And Virpal, do you worry about that? When you suddenly see talk of protectionism, about those walls going up, for a business that is about breaking down those walls, does that worry you?
Let me marinate you with some data around that. The writing on the wall is pretty clear. Wherever in the world we have seen bilateral trade agreements or free trade practices or policies, the growth has been much higher than the global economy growth rate. The Pacific Alliance grew at 8%, the ASEAN at 5%, the EU at 7.5%. Mexico trade continues to outperform the largest economy in Latin America, that is Brazil, because of the trade agreements that they have. I think protectionism is the reality of today's world. I mean, the developed world is rolling out as much as 5 protectionist measures a week, which is tough. But at the same time, today's world is about opening doors and not closing doors.
Is there enough cooperation? Because we talk about the Gulf Cooperation Council, but in some respects, it doesn't actually deliver too much as far as agreement is concerned, because each country doing a very different thing, focusing on different industries. Are they competing, or are they actually cooperating?
No, I think they're complementing each other very well, and I think that even though the progress is not as fast as we would want it to be, but there is progress. If we look at renewable energy, so the UAE has been at the forefront, but I think that has encouraged other countries to move along. We see that becoming a big focus area for Saudi Arabia and focus area for Oman and Kuwait. So I think there is a good sense of collaboration, and I think there's a good sense of each country encouraging the other to move towards a certain certain sector.
Danny?
And I would just say that with regard to the GCC, the cooperation just in the last couple of years has increased and gotten even more close. The value-added tax, which is being implemented by the end of the year, is a very, very good example of that. For the first time, there will be a VAT, a GCC-wide. There are excise taxes that have been created GCC-wide. New standards are being put in place for the GCC, and this is all as a result of closer cooperation within the GCC organization.
But I also think, in today's globalized world, it almost mandates that it's not entirely just up to governments and cooperation between countries to build this wave to the next level. I think it's also for corporations, it's also for individuals, businesses to play a role and make this all work together.
Danny, when we look at the region, we talk about cooperation between countries here. One issue right now is the Qatar problem. A blockade as far as trade is concerned, concerns over the politics. What does that mean for the cohesiveness of this region, and certainly this region looking out?
Well, there's no getting around that this is a very, very serious problem. And it's a political problem which now has economic dimensions to it as well. Most companies have found a way to sort of be quiet about what they're doing and continue the business, continue the movement of goods and services. They may have changed some of the ways, the directions that they're bringing the goods and services in, but they are doing the business that needs to be done to move the diversification forward.
Yeah, and Vipul, from a purely practical point of view, what does it mean for how you operate?
I mean, Maersk is a global company that operates in 130 countries, and it's important for us, like any other big corporation, that we are totally compliant with any regulations or laws. And likewise, in this case, we've stopped moving to and fro cargo to Qatar from there. We are moving it now from Salalah. So yes, the companies have found way around to go to ensure that business goes on, but it's not to the same scale. And it does has a huge economic impact as well, outside that of the political.
For now, thanks very much. So that's how changes in global trade are reshaping the business landscape of this region. But what about the other big concern here, the price of oil? Oil prices have fallen significantly over the past few years, and that causes concern for the governments of this region that rely on it to meet their spending commitments. So are governments here too reliant on oil? I've been finding out. Many countries across the Gulf have begun diversifying their economies, but progress has been mixed. There's been success in industries like aviation and logistics, creating a gateway between Asia, Africa and Europe. Investment in tourism, financial services and banking has also helped generate new sources of income. But there are still challenges. Cutting red tape and improving education and skills are key. That could determine how well economies here cope with life after oil. So let's talk about some of those issues with my guests here today. Dr. Dalia, maybe I can start with you on this, because diversification in this region clearly a big focus now. We've heard all sorts of announcements from various countries in the Gulf. What does diversification mean for countries here?
So I think there's two things that we could talk about here: energy diversification and economy diversification. And for energy diversification, so if we talk about the UAE, for example, a country that's been, I would say, around 99% that has depended on gas as a source of fuel, has now, progressed a lot in terms of diversifying their portfolio, particularly around bringing solar energy into the mix, and then coal as well, with the 2.4 gigawatt Hassyan project. So that's one aspect. And then the other aspect in terms of economy diversification, a lot of what we had spoken about before, which is looking at innovation, building the whole entrepreneurship ecosystem, allowing for innovation not only on trade but all sorts of services, and the Smart Dubai initiative, and how do we bring digital into the day-to-day lives of the citizens in the UAE.
Each country in the region concentrating on very different things. I mean, we're here in Dubai. You look at Dubai, it's tourism, it's financial services, it's banking. It's not easy to compare like for like because all these countries are doing different things, but who's made the most progress in the Gulf?
I wouldn't want to say that one is doing more progress than the other, but I like to see them as all complementing each other. And I think there's a lot of similarities in these countries, and there's a lot that they learn from each other. So as you mentioned, yes, Dubai has, there's advancement in terms of, bringing digitization, positioning Dubai as a smart city, but then also in Abu Dhabi in the industrialization in the oil and gas markets and the servicing of the oil gas fields, and being more efficient there and driving efficiency there as well. And then renewable energy, which we see also across the board. So you see Oman, for example, which is a great, Oman and Saudi, a great place for wind technology as well. Whereas you may not have so much wind opportunities here in the UAE, and you see solar being more flourished here. So I think they all complement each other in a very cohesive way.
Danny, we heard in that piece there about how important it is to address some of the challenges, those challenges being perhaps skills and education and cutting red tape. When you're dealing with American businesses here, Is it as easy as the authorities would have us believe to set up and to operate in the Gulf?
It's gotten a lot easier. The UAE in particular is constantly trying to be on the cutting edge of business reform because it wants to be the place where foreign companies will choose to come and set up first to establish their beachhead, if you will, in the region and then broaden out to other countries as their business grows. So the UAE makes great efforts to cut down on the red tape. There's still more things that can be done. They're working on a company's ownership law and other measures that will come in the years ahead, but the UAE and Saudi Arabia and other countries have made great progress in this area, and will continue to do so.
Is that progress fast enough? Because we talk about life after oil. We've seen a big fall in the price of oil. We've seen revenues fall. Governments around the region have to balance their books. Is that change coming quickly enough?
It is, but we also have to think about how quickly a society can take change, and we have to measure, and we have to make it palatable for the people. I mean, just 40 years ago, I've been living and traveling in this region for 30 years, and just 40 years ago, the difference, the economy was 90% dependent on the oil revenue. They've turned that on its head. Today, the economy is 30% dependent on oil revenue in the UAE, and the diversification strategy has resulted in the economy being 70% of all these other verticals. That's a huge amount of change to occur in such a short period of time. And it will continue. And the leadership here, who has a great vision, will continue to work with the people to bring them along in that regard. But it's got to be at the pace that they can be comfortable with and that can be achievable.
Vipul,
sustainable.
It strikes me too that diversification is going to be about trade policy, about the role of a country in the world and you know, how it sees either competitors or trading partners. What do you see of that with your business?
I think clearly, like Danny said, the leadership has made its intent very clear, and the change has been massive, especially over the last few decades. There is definitely manufacturing, but trading has huge potential. UAE is the third largest trading hub to Singapore and Hong Kong, and Maersk themselves do about 25% of all exports, 17% of all imports coming out of UAE. And I think it is a good start has been made. The change has had different stages of progress depending on how the change was brought in. But I think leadership has made their intent very clear that it has to be a diversified economy. And
Dalia, when we talk about the diversification of these economies, there's always an underlying issue about jobs. We know that this region has a huge young population. Finding enough jobs for that population is going to be a key issue. How do you make sure that the economy diversifies whilst creating those jobs? Mm-hmm. Where will those jobs come from?
I think in the UAE, what's really been a great advancement as well is putting a Minister of Youth, who I believe is a lady and is in her early 20s, and I think that's given a voice to the youth of the UAE, and really kind of incorporating them into the vision of the UAE and where we want to take this country next, and how do we incorporate the youth and make them also accountable to that strategy. And I think, once you have that engagement and that dialogue and the more empowerment that you give to the youth, the most likely that you would take them into consideration as you draw your employment strategy.
And it starts with education. It starts with education. And the UAE and the region as a whole is really focused on providing the opportunities for their youth in all of these sectors and areas going forward.
I think while education is important, skill development is equally important. So I think it's fair to say that you're worried how these new age technologies may become a threat to jobs. But if you're able to create skills for the new age technologies, then you create newer jobs, different kind of jobs. And again, the intent in the leadership here is very clear around.
Aviation, been a huge growth area for countries of the Gulf, be that Emirates, Etihad or Qatar Airways. We also saw a lot of problems with the Open Skies Agreement. And it's sort of that perception, isn't it, that the rest of the world is willing to embrace the region as long as it doesn't go too far. And the Open Skies dispute about whether Gulf carriers could operate in the United States and what landing slots they would get was a real issue. Has that gone away?
has not gone away, and the three major U.S. airlines continue to lobby in Washington for relief, continue to lobby in Washington for the Trump administration to put some sort of restrictions on the Gulf carriers. But I have to tell you, the real development came when the Gulf carriers decided that the Indian market was one that they could access and transport thousands, millions of Indian visitors to the United States, to Europe, with one flight or two flights, as opposed to having to take 3 or 4 flights to change to get all the way back to California. And that's where this really started. So again, Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Doha being a hub between East and West.
Just this week, Saudi Arabia announces $500 billion. It would create a multi-country free trade area, all sorts of industries, creating thousands of jobs. Does the Gulf see that as an opportunity, or does it see that as a huge threat because someone else is doing something maybe that they're not?
The GCC countries want Saudi to be successful. They do not want Saudi to fail. And there's been a great study of the successes here and how they can be replicated elsewhere in the region. This is a huge commitment by the new Crown Prince, and it's a commitment with Egypt and with Jordan to again, as you said, to make it an international city. And it is new, and it is a big development. And I think there's a very good chance it's going to succeed.
And Dalia, when you hear those announcements, or an announcement of such scale and scope and ambition, what does it mean for your business?
I think it's exciting. I think it's very exciting. And I think it's, you know, for us, it gives us clarity on where these countries want to go. And really, you know, it's very important for us to understand the needs of our customers. At the end of the day, these governments and these organizations are our customers.
And how important is private sector investment versus that support from the government? Because we've seen this Saudi Arabia announcement will involve a lot of sovereign wealth money, but also private investors, large and small. How does that mix work? Do you need the boost from the government to get these things going, and then it falls to the private sector?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a partnership, and I think it makes sense always to partner, you know, to have that healthy partnership between government and the private sector. And that's what we've seen in the UAE, and I think it would work very well in Saudi as well.
UAE leaders say all the time that they want skin in the game by the international companies that come here. They don't want just people that are coming here selling their wares. They want international companies to come here and invest and be part of the ecosystem.
Well, thank you all. A fascinating discussion. Danny Seabright, President of the UAE-US Business Council, Vipul Sardana, Chief Executive and Head of Maersk Finance, and Dr. Dalia Al-Mathana, President and Chief Executive of GE Gulf. Thank you to you all. And thank you too for watching. That's all we've got time for on this edition of Talking Business. But we'll see you again very soon. Bye-bye.